많이 만나서 인터뷰를 해왔습니다. 제가 브래드쇼를 직접 진행한다는 이유만으로 얻게 되는 아주 고맙고 특별한 은혜라고 할 수 있죠. 제가 그렇게 만나본 분들 중에는 이런 분은 방송에서만 이야기를 듣는 것이 아니라 한국에 직접 초청을 해서 더 많은 이야기들을 브래드TV 시청자들과 함께 얼굴을 맞대고 강의도 듣고 질문도 하고 그런 시간을 가지면 좋겠다, 이런 생각을 참 많이 하게 됩니다. 그래서 저는 지난해에는 마크 빌츠 목사님을 초청해서 컨퍼런스를 진행했고, 또 지난달 말에는 랍비 이지악 샤피라를 초청해서 컨퍼런스를 진행했으며, 또 많은 분들이 그 현장을 찾아와 주셨습니다. 그리고 이번에는 미국에서도 아주 권위 있는 이슬람 전문가 조엘 리차드슨을 초청해서 컨퍼런스를 진행합니다. 조엘 리처드슨은 이슬람과 마지막 때에 관한 여러 권의 저서를 집필해 이미 미국에서도 베스트셀러가 되기도 했고, 또 현재도 전 세계를 다니며 이슬람과 마지막 때에 대해 많은 사람들에게 강의를 하는 등 권위를 인정받은 분이지만, 또 그만큼 과격파 무슬림으로부터 늘 위협을 받는 분이기도 합니다. 지금까지 브래드TV에서 진행해왔던 컨퍼런스가 그래왔듯이 저는 이번 조엘 리차드슨 컨퍼런스 역시 마지막 때를 준비하며 살아가는 여러분의 신앙생활에 아주 중요한 시간이 되리라 확신합니다. 이번 컨퍼런스에서 조엘 리차드슨은 임박한 때와 메시아의 즉위식, 이슬람의 종말론, 이스마엘을 향한 하나님의 마음, 이렇게 세 가지 주제의 강의를 진행하게 됩니다. 브래드TV에서 초청하고 브래드TV에서 진행하는 컨퍼런스는 다른 컨퍼런스와는 분명히 차원이 다른 그야말로 명품 컨퍼런스라고 할 수 있습니다. 이번 12월 2일 오후 2시부터 한국교회 100주년 기념관 대강당에서 열리는 브래드TV 주최 조엘 리차드슨 초청 컨퍼런스에 여러분을 초대합니다. 얼마 전 저희 브래드TV 방송에서는 마지막 때 적그리스도와 관련된 강의 영상이 방송이 된 적이 있었습니다. 그동안 우리가 일반적으로 알기로는 적그리스도 하면은 유럽연합에서 나온다, 또는 로마 교황청의 교황이다, 이런 이야기들을 많이 했었는데, 이번 강의에서는 적그리스도는 바로 무슬림 출신일 것이다, 이슬람권에서 나올 것이다, 이런 내용으로 강의를 하시면서 우리 브래드TV 시청자들에게 많은 관심과 또 시청률을 올려주신 분이 계십니다. 바로 조엘 리차드슨이라는 분이신데요. 그분이 쓴 책이 바로 제가 읽었던 책입니다. 바로 이슬람의 안티크라이스트, 이 책을 쓰신 분. 강의 내용도 굉장히 저희한테는 생소하면서 또 충격이었지만, 도대체 어떤 더 깊은 내용이 있을지 본인을 직접 만나서 좀 인터뷰를 좀 하고 싶었습니다. 그래서 제가 오늘은 조엘 리차드슨을 찾아서 여기까지 또 찾아왔습니다. Hi, nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you, Brad.
우선 한국의 우리 브래드TV 시청자들에게 본인 소개와 인사를 좀 해주시죠.
Well, first of all, let me just say hello to South Korea, to the Korean viewers. It's a blessing and honor to be able to just share with you, and I have a great affinity for the work that the Lord is doing among the Korean believers, among the Korean church, not only in Korea, but globally. As I travel throughout the Middle East, everywhere I go, I see Korean, I run into and meet Korean missionaries, and so I'm gratefully indebted to the Korean church.
그러면은 어떻게 해서 이렇게 우리 조엘 씨는 이슬람과 무슬림, 그리고 무슬림 속에서 적그리스도 이런 거에 대해서 연구를 하시게 됐는지 우선 그 얘기부터 좀 해주시죠.
I've been involved in reaching out to Muslims since the early 90s, and it was after several years of interfaith dialogue, I'll say evangelism to Muslims, primarily through email dialogue. So the largest online resource it's really a collaboration of Christian missionaries and workers that are reaching out to Muslims. It's called answeringislam.org, and it's translated into several different languages. Well, after several years of working for Answering Islam, doing email correspondence. It was during this whole time, 9/11 unfolded. And what we started seeing after 9/11 was a lot of Western Americans, Europeans converting to Islam. And so this was definitely a bit of a wake-up call. And so in my history of reaching out to Muslims, I had always categorized Islam as sort of just another false religion. To me, you had Hinduism, you had Buddhism, you had Islam. I just thought these are just various false world religions, But it was during this time, as I was dealing with Americans, some of them even Christians, having been raised in a church, that were converting to Islam or in the process of converting to Islam. And I was in dialogue with them via email, giving all of the right answers, and many of them were nevertheless slipping through our hands and converting to Islam. It was during that time that I started to really discern that Islam, it's more than just another false religion. There really is a profoundly seductive spirit behind Islam. And it was during this time that I was also deeply involved in studying and working through Islamic eschatology. What does Islam teach about the end times, the end of the age, the return of Jesus, and all of these things? And so in 2003, 2004, I wrote the book Islamic Antichrist. I actually self-published it, and then it was later republished. And so this is really what I've become most known for, sort of my introduction into public ministry as an author, as Joel Richardson. And Joel Richardson is actually a pseudonym because really anyone who is writing nowadays, with technology, anyone who is writing critically of Islam and who wants to serve in any way as a missionary, or just for security purposes, most often is using some form of pseudonym. And this is the nature of the world that we live in. And so often you hear stories of missionaries who's, they're compromised. They speak at a church and they say, please don't put our name on the internet, but then it's on the bulletin, and next thing you know, they're getting kicked out of the country. So I've been using a pseudonym for many years now, but in a lot of ways, Joel Richardson is I'm as used to it as my real name. But so yeah, the author of Islamic Antichrist, and then I've written a few books since then. And then over the past decade, I've really just been traveling globally, awakening the church to the central role of Islam in the last days, awakening the church to the urgency of the hour with regard to the return of Jesus, trying to approach all of these things in a very balanced, gospel-centered way, and again, just awakening the church to the urgency of the hour.
전 세계에 이렇게 이슬람의 숫자가 늘어나면서 IS가 득세를 하고 이런 것들이 결국은 이슬람 종교의 종말론과 서로 이렇게 연결되어 있는 겁니까? 그리고 만약에 이슬람의 종말론이 있다면 기독교의 종말론과 내용이 비슷한 겁니까? 어떻습니까?
So probably a decade and a half ago, I really started pouring into trying to understand what does Islam teach with regard to the end times. And I began studying this really just out of fascination. And I studied, and I don't read Arabic or Persian, so I can't go to the direct sources. However, I have read every single resource available, whether online or in printed form, that has been translated in English. So I've gone to the Muslim sources and very thoroughly analyzed this information. And what I found in quite a fascinating and amazing way is that Muslims have a very specific belief regarding the end times, and it's very similar to the biblical story in just a very general sense of what happens in the last days with the Antichrist and the false prophet and the return of Jesus, except they've flipped the whole story on its head. It's kind of a mirror image where they've taken a lot of the, we'll say the good guys of the Bible, and they've recast them in their narrative as the bad guys. So, in the biblical story, For instance, you have the Christians and the Jews that are persecuted by the system of the Antichrist, by the armies of the Antichrist. Well, in the Islamic narrative, it's the Jews and the Christians that are to be converted, that are to be forced to become Muslims. And so they become the targets in the Islamic narrative. And this is just one example of what I call an anti-parallel, the numerous anti-parallels that exist within the Islamic traditions. And there's many, many, many of them. And so this is it's a fascinating subject, but what it does, because we don't look to Islamic prophecies as legitimate prophecy, only the Bible is inspired. But what it does do is it points to the active satanic involvement in the history, the development, and the evolution of Islamic tradition, to where today ISIS, all these young men and women from all over the world that are being recruited to ISIS, they are largely being recruited because they believe Islamic prophecy is being fulfilled. And it's not just ISIS. On the other side, you have Iran. They also are being driven and guided by Islamic prophecy. So Islamic eschatology, Islamic understanding of the end times, it is literally driving the world right now. It's changing the world. And the church, the world, the politicians need to be aware of this. They need to study this information. But how much more the church, who is praying and concerned with the events and what's unfolding across the earth, who want to complete the Great Commission, we need to be aware of this information.
이슬람에는 그 시아파가 있고 수니파가 있지 않습니까? 그 시아파, 수니파 똑같은 개념으로 그렇게 종말론을 받아들이는 겁니까?
Essentially, the two primary sects within Islam is you have the Sunnis and the Shia. Now, the Sunnis are the majority sect. They make up roughly 85 to 87% of the Islamic world. The Shia, roughly 13%. They both have very, very similar beliefs about the end times. There are some minor differences. The most significant difference is they all believe in the coming of a Messiah figure that they call the Mahdi. In English, you could just say the Mahdi. And he is this Messiah figure that comes at the end of the age, and he will cause Islam to be superior throughout the world. And we can talk some more about him. But the difference between the Sunnis and the Shia is the Sunnis believe that the Mahdi, he just emerges out of mankind. Anybody could potentially be the Mahdi. He will simply be recognized by the Muslims throughout the earth. The Shia specifically believe that he is an individual. He was this young boy who was 8 years old, roughly 800 years ago, who just disappeared. And he's a direct descendant of Muhammad. So they believe this particular individual is sort of going to come back. They believe that Allah has sort of hidden him and kept him alive for hundreds of years, and he's going to sort of return. And he will reveal himself as they call him, Muhammad al-Mahdi. And sometimes they'll refer to him, you may see this in the news, referred to as the 12th Imam, because they believe he's the 12th descendant after the successor of Muhammad. So that's the difference in terms of how he emerges. But once he emerges, all Muslims believe the same general things. The difference, of course, is the Shia believe that all the Sunnis will become Shia, and the Sunnis believe that all the Shia will become Sunni. So there's that sectarian aspect of it. But basically, they all believe that he will come and cause Islam to be superior throughout the world, cause Christians to convert to Islam, and he will be involved in the slaughtering and the killing of Jews and the conquering of Israel and this sort of things.
그러니까 그 12번째 이맘이라는 인물이 마흐디라는 거죠.
The Shia would refer to the Mahdi as the 12th Imam. So what the Shia believe is that, so the difference between the Sunnis and the Shia is after Muhammad died, there was this division among his followers. Some said the successorship, the office of Muhammad should go to his friends, his companions, the Sahaba, they called them, sort of like the disciples. And then others, and those are the Sunnis, now others said that it should go to his family line, that Ali, who was Muhammad's stepson, or son-in-law, that he should be the rightful successor. And so those are the Shia. That's the word Shia is like the Shi. It translates as the Shi'ali, the partisans of Ali. And so it would be Ali and then his children that are viewed as the imams. And so the Shia, those in Iran, they believe that the imams sort of had this divine empowerment to interpret and interpret the words of the Quran and Muhammad and so forth.
그러면 우리 기독교에서는 2000년 전에 오셨던 예수님이 하늘로 승천하시고 다시 우리에게 오신다고 약속을 하셨기 때문에 재림 예수를 기다리는 건데 무슬림들이 기다리는 마흐디는 재림하는 것은 아니고 그럼 어떤 환경 속에서 어느 때 그 마흐디가 올 거라고 무슬림들은 믿고 있습니까?
So in the same way that Christians are awaiting the return of Jesus to restore all things and establish the restored throne of David and the resurrection of the dead and renew all things, in the same way that we're awaiting Jesus, the Messiah, to come back, Muslims are actually awaiting two primary Messiah figures. The first Messiah figure is the Mahdi, Imam al-Mahdi, and he's their primary Messiah figure. And he returns, again, to cause Islam to be superior throughout the world, but Muslims also believe that Jesus will return. They call him Isa, the Messiah, but they believe that Jesus comes back as an assistant, subservient to the Mahdi. And one of the primary purposes for Jesus returning, according to Muslims, is to tell the Christians of the world, you've had it wrong all along. They teach that he'll come back and say, your Bible's corrupt. You corrupted the Bible. You lost the truth of God. I never claimed to be the Son of God. I never claimed to be divine. I never died on a cross. I was a Muslim. Islam is the only true religion. You all need to convert to Islam. This is the religion of God, and you need to submit to Mahdi because he is the vice regent of Allah on the earth. And so it's when you start looking at this is when I say it's sort of an anti-parallel to the biblical picture, because the Bible teaches that the Antichrist comes at the end of the age before the return of Jesus, and he also has an assistant, which Revelation refers to as the false prophet. And this false prophet, it says he has two horns like a ram or like a lamb, and yet he speaks with the mouth of a dragon. So it's, in the same way that we have a wolf in sheep's clothing, you have a dragon in sheep's clothing, in a ram's clothing. And this false prophet, his primary purpose is to point to and cause the inhabitants of the world to submit to the Antichrist. And so you can see potentially that Islam has actually prepared the Islamic world to receive the Antichrist and the false prophet, believing that this is their Mahdi, their Messiah figure, as well as Jesus. Of course, it wouldn't be the real Jesus. And that Satan has actually created these counter prophecies to prepare 1.6 billion people throughout the world to receive the Antichrist and the false prophet.
자, 그러면 무슬림들이 기다리는 마흐디는 하늘에서 구름을 타고 내려올까요? 아니면 사람들 속에서 인간의 모습으로 태어나는 걸까요?
So, and this is essential that we understand that there is no such thing as the Mahdi. However, there will be deceivers. Jesus warned there will be many false prophets. So, when you understand Islamic prophecy, what they teach is that the Mahdi will not actually claim to be the Mahdi, that he will simply be recognized by the Muslims as the Mahdi. And so throughout history, throughout Islamic history, there's actually been several false Mahdis. They call them Mutamahdis, like a false Christ, but they're a false Mahdi. And each time that they've emerged and claimed to be the Mahdi, they've each time gathered a significant following, and it's always led to bloody uprisings and so forth. There was one even as recent as the late 70s. But they've always been Sunnis. They've always been Sunni false Mahdis. So this is the first time that, in Islamic history, that the world now is so connected through technology and everything that if there were a false Mahdi, if there were some governmental religious leader that emerged and he had a Messiah complex and he was able to sort of rally a large percentage of the Islamic world in the same way, for instance, that al-Baghdadi was able to rally so many to say that he is the caliph. if someone emerged that said and claimed, or even if just everyone thought he was the Mahdi, the power of a grassroots movement, a global Islamic grassroots movement to gather around this Messiah figure is tremendous. I mean, and this is something that believers need to be aware of this dangerous potential, but not just believers. Government officials need to be aware of this because this is affecting potential future warfare. I mean, this is a very relevant factor that's affecting the Islamic world right now. So there's various traditions as to how he appears, but most often he just emerges as a leader. And suddenly the Muslims begin to look at him and say, this is the Mahdi. By what he does, by the acts that he carries out. And there's some various prophecies that we are to look to. I'll give you an example. I met with a very prominent Muslim leader in Turkey. He's actually the most published author in the whole Islamic world, with roughly 300 books and documentaries. And he won't actually say that he's the Mahdi, but he sort of wants his followers to think that he's the Mahdi. And so I asked him, I was on live Turkish television, and I said, I know that the Mahdi would never claim to be the Mahdi. I said, but do you ever hope, or do you ever wonder if you are the Mahdi? And he just kind of lit up and he began saying, oh. And he started quoting all of these Islamic prophecies. And this is the thing, is there's hundreds of them. And because of the nature of Islamic prophecy, they're very fluid. They're very you can manipulate them. You can sort of pick and choose which ones that you want to try to, fit your particular agenda. And so he began saying, according to Islamic prophecy, the Mahdi would have a very wide chest. And he would say, as you can see, I have a very wide chest. And then he said, according to Islamic prophecies, the Mahdi would have a prominent crease between his brow. I would be lying to you if I said I do not have this crease. And so he went down probably 6 or 7 different prophecies that he was obviously saying he fulfills without actually saying that he's the Mahdi. But then someone else could come along and say, oh no, the one about the crease, that's not authentic. And so it's dangerous in that, I mean, you look at the way Christians approach eschatology. We have all sorts of debates and opinions. Islamic prophecy is a far larger corpus of traditions, and so it's much more malleable. It's easy for a deceiver, a false prophet, to manipulate, and thus it's much more dangerous.
그럼 지금 무슬림들이 생각하기에는 그 마흐디가 올 때가 다 됐다라고 느낄까요? 아니면 아직 좀 멀었다라고 생각할까요? 아니면 지금 와 있을 수도 있겠고요.
So there was a very significant Pew poll research study that was done just a few years ago, and they asked thousands of individuals from, I want to say it was about 23 different countries. And they asked them this. They said, do you believe that the coming of the Mahdi is imminent in your lifetime? So this was not a question of, do you believe that the Mahdi will come? As if we ask Christians, do you believe someday Jesus will return? Do you believe it will happen imminently in your lifetime? And the number shocked everyone, because everyone expected it to be a small number. In Iraq and Afghanistan, it was pushing 90%. Said yes, they believe it will come in their lifetime. In Turkey, it was 67%. Turkey is a very mixed country of a lot of very moderate, Western-leaning Muslims. 67%. That's a massive majority. Overall, throughout the entire Islamic world, it was over 40%. Now, that was a few years ago. Since what's taking place with ISIS, the eschatological end-time expectation of the Islamic world has gone through the roof. And the reason is because 2 of the primary prophecies that they look to for the end times is that there would be this massive war in Asham, which is Syria, and all sorts of social upheaval and division in Iraq. And so they're looking right now, it's what's taking place with what began as the civil war in Syria and all that's unfolding, and they're saying this is fulfilling the Islamic prophecies precisely. And so again, if you talk to, not all Muslims, but if you talk to Muslims, there is a very high belief, a very high percentage of those that believe that the Islamic prophecies are falling into alignment.
만약에 마흐디가 왔든 아니면 앞으로 오게 되든 그 마흐디가 오게 되면은 전 세계 인류를 향해서 특별히 또 무슬림들을 향해서 어떤 일들을 하게 될까요?
So essentially, when you look at the general story of what they believe he will rise up as a leader and he will unify the Islamic world. In the same way that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the caliph of ISIS, he was hoping that once he declared himself the caliph, he was hoping the whole Islamic world would just join. And there was certainly a big number that have joined, and even little, cells all over the world are making the pledge of allegiance to Baghdadi. But it's not as significant as they had hoped, certainly. But the traditions regarding the Mehdi is that once he's acknowledged that he will unify the Islamic world, and this is what's so interesting, is that the Bible says that the Antichrist emerges, that he initiates his leadership, he initiates his career by unifying 10 nations, 10 horns as it's referred to throughout Revelation. And so in the same way that the Antichrist will revive an empire, there's this yearning, this desire throughout the Islamic world to revive an empire, and their prophecies say that's exactly what the Mehdi will do.
그럼 다른 종교를 가졌던 사람들한테는 어떻게 할까요? 예를 들어서 뭐 기독교이라든가 또는 캐톨릭 신자라든가 유대인들한테는 이 마흐디가 어떻게 할까요?
So according to Sharia, according to Islamic law, Jews and Christians, if they live under the caliphate, the government of Islam, they are allowed to pay a tax, a protection tax called the jizya tax. And if they pay this very heavy tax, then they are to be called dhimmis, subjected peoples, and they are to be protected, allegedly protected. And you have this throughout much of the history of Islam. However, under the rule of Mehdi, that as well as Jesus, there's a tradition that says that when Jesus comes back, he will abolish the jizya. And what that means is that until Jesus returns, you have the option of living as a subjected person, humiliated. You can't rebuild your churches. You have to, wear silly clothing to distinguish you as a dhimmi, as a subjected person. This is where in history, the beginning of this tradition of wearing a yellow patch to identify yourself as one of the others, a non-Muslim, began in the Islamic world. But once Jesus returns, they say that he will abolish the jizya. And so again, Islamic tradition and any of the Islamic books that you read, they will say that once Jesus returns, you don't have the option anymore. You either become a Muslim or die, period.
그럼 그 마흐디의 정치적, 군사적 위상은 어떻습니까?
Whereas we compartmentalize in the West, we compartmentalize different offices. Within Islam, they have brought together under one head, under the caliph. And they believe the Mehdi will be the caliph, by the way. They believe he will be a caliph. So under the office of the caliph, you have the religious, the military, and the political, all brought under one office. And so you will have the most significant form of religious, military, political dictatorship than you can ever imagine. Pope, president, and general, all wrapped up into one office. And it's also an interesting part of Islamic theology which says that once the caliph comes, all Muslims are obligated to make what's called the bay'ah, which is the pledge of allegiance. It translates as the pledge of allegiance to the Mehdi, and the pledge literally is for your life, that you will lay down your life and submit to everything he does as long as he is implementing Islamic law and functioning according to the law of the Quran and Muhammad. All Muslims globally are obligated to pledge allegiance to him. And you can see shadows of that. You can see shadows of the mark of the beast and the system of the Antichrist in that. And so this is why you have, in different parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan and in Africa, you have these different groups, and you'll see it in the news. They are making the pledge to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the caliph of ISIS. So they're all over the world, but they're making the bay'ah pledge to ISIS.
그러니까 조엘 씨는 지금 이야기하셨던 그 마흐디가 우리 성경에서 이야기하는 적그리스도다 이렇게 지금 생각하시는 거예요?
Well, again, I'm always careful because I don't want to say the Mahdi, because the truth is the Bible is my standard, and the Bible doesn't talk about the Mahdi. So I don't believe there is such a thing as the Mahdi. But what I do believe is that Satan has created these prophecies. He's created these traditions, that he has used Islam as his counter plan, and that I think there's a strong chance that these prophecies, these traditions, will be used by Satan to rally the armies of the Antichrist, and that quite possibly the armies of the Antichrist will not believe he's the Antichrist, they'll believe that he is the Mahdi. I think there's a strong possibility, but we don't know that for sure, because it doesn't say so in the Bible. So I want to be careful, but I think when we look at it, the evidence is pretty strong. At the very least, we know that Satan is involved in these traditions.
그런데 마태복음 24장에 보면은 그 마지막 때에 멸망에 가증한 것이 거룩한 곳에 설계된 것을 보거든, 이런 구절이 있어요. 이것은 뭐냐면 적그리스도가 예루살렘의 성전에 서게 될 것이다, 이런 의미인데, 그러면 그 마흐디와 이스라엘, 예루살렘, 성전과 어떤 연합하는 그런 시간이 있습니까?
So among some of the traditions, among some of the Islamic prophecies, there is a prophecy that says the Mahdi will actually engage in a series of treaties or covenants with the Romans, which is most often understood as the West by Muslims. So Osama bin Laden would refer to George Bush as "you, O dog of the Romans." Al-Rum is in Arabic. And so whenever you see references to the Romans, this usually means the West or Christianity. But so you have first this prophecy that says the Mahdi will engage in these treaties, and then one of them says specifically the final treaty will be mediated by a descendant of Aaron, in other words, a Levite, a priest, a Jewish priest. And so it's interesting that the Bible says the Antichrist will engage in a covenant. Daniel 9, it says it's either he will make a covenant or enforce a covenant, or he will enforce a strong covenant. There's some differences of interpretation, translation of this verse. And then in Islamic prophecy, you have references that their Mahdi will engage in a covenant that will be mediated by a priestly Jew with the West. So you have references to peace treaties. There's also an interesting, and I'll mention this, is that the Bible says that the Antichrist will make a treaty, but in the middle of that treaty, in the middle of the 7-year treaty, he will break it. He will set himself up on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. He will sit in the seat of God. Okay, so that's clear in the Bible. Again, Daniel 9, it also references this covenant with death in Isaiah 28. Well, what's so interesting about that is that when you look at the history of Muhammad, and Muslims look to Muhammad as the perfect example, they say he's the perfect human being. There was this story where Muhammad had told his followers, they were still new, he was still sort of a new religious leader, he had about 1,200 men. He said, we're going to go make Hajj. So he had been kicked out of Mecca, he was in Medina, he said, we're going to go make pilgrimage to Mecca. And as they were coming, the largest tribe of the region, they came and they interjected and they said, where do you think you're going, Muhammad? And this was at the spring of Hudaybiyah. This is called Hudaybiyah. And so they stopped him, and this is the Qurayshi tribe, the Qurayshis, the most powerful tribe in the region. And they said, you're not going to go make pilgrimage. And they really embarrassed Muhammad in front of his men. But what they did is they entered into a treaty. They made a treaty with him. They said, listen, you can come back next year and you can make Hajj. They said, but here's the treaty. It's going to be a 10-year treaty. From now on, if any of your Muslims want to leave and join us and become Qurayshis, they want to leave Islam, you have to let them leave. However, if any of the Qurayshis come and they want to join you, you have to send them back. So it was a very lopsided treaty in favor of the Qurayshis. Muhammad was shamed. He left, his men were all upset with him. He woke up the next morning and he had a revelation, alleged revelation, where he says God told him, from now on, from that day forward, anyone that joins the Muslims as they attack these caravans or these villages, they get this big percentage of the plunder and the spoil. So within 2 years, what they started doing is they started raiding a series of Jewish villages and decimating the Jewish population of Arabia. Within 2 years, the Muslims went from 1,200 men to 10,000 because they became desert pirates. They were literally just raiding and pillaging. People would get the wealth, the plunder, the booty, the spoil, the sex slaves, all of these things. And so this was a huge recruitment tool. And then, once he became 10,000 strong, he broke the treaty. He went and he crushed the power of the Qurayshis, and he retook Mecca. So what's interesting is that Muslims look to Muhammad as the perfect example, as the greatest military strategist ever. And right in his story is this prominent story of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, where he made a treaty, and then once he was strong enough, he broke it. And that's exactly what it says the Antichrist will do. He'll make a treaty and he'll break it. Muslims will look to Muhammad and they look to that example. Now, of course, the scriptures also say that the Antichrist will set himself up. 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 4, the Antichrist will set himself in the temple of God. Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 9, 11, and 12 all make reference to the Antichrist abominating the temple, abolishing the sacrifices, abolishing the daily perpetual sacrifice. The tamid is the word in Hebrew. And Islamic prophecy makes it very clear that the seat, the very location that the Mahdi will rule the world from, is from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So again, you can see the satanic hand in the history and the evolution of these prophecies. The Bible says the Antichrist will set himself up in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. Islamic prophecy says their Messiah figure will rule from the Temple Mount and cause Islam to be the only religion throughout the world. Again, this is what I mean by an anti-parallel.
적그리스도와 다시 오신 예수님 만나게 될까요?
Well, the scriptures are clear that when Jesus returns, he will kill the Antichrist, and he will kill the false prophet, and he will kill the armies of the Antichrist and the false prophet. Now, one thing that we haven't talked about yet is that in the same way that Muslims are waiting for the Mahdi and the Islamic Isa, the Islamic Jesus, they're also awaiting an Antichrist figure, and they call him Ad-Dajjal, Ad-Dajjal al-Masih, the charlatan, the false Messiah, the Antichrist. And